There are many ways in the NFL to construct a roster. There's the idea that you load up on nothing but older veterans who have been there before and are established. There's the opposite idea that you create a youth movement and bring the core up together. There's the idea that you trade away all of your draft picks, or a good chunk of them, and there's the idea that you stockpile draft picks and try to get as many chances as possible to strike gold. There are certain strategies that involve loading up on one position in particular, or on one side of the ball, and hoping that the weaknesses are masked pretty well because the strength is so darn strong that it's enough to compensate for it. You get the idea. There is no one way to make a roster. However, the most important part when creating a roster is to have a plan. Everything in a life of that magnitude should be done with a plan of attack in mind, because if you don't have a plan, you're going to be in some serious trouble. Case in point, what happened in 1970 with Washington, as in the team we've been watching this whole time. To be fair, this was a team that was already playing behind the eight ball, as their head coach at the start of the preseason, Vince Lombardi, tragically passed away at the age of 57 years old. So when Bill Austin was thrust into the interim role out of nowhere due to Lombardi's poor health, it's not like he went into the season with any idea of what to do, even if he had been a head coach before, albeit a very unsuccessful one. However, his idea of constructing a roster was so bad, so stupid, and so outlandish that even his own quarterback, Sonny Jurgensen, called him out on this and wondered, Coach, what the heck are we doing? That's when you know it's bad. It's one thing to cut your starter right before the season starts. It's another thing to cut both the starter and the backup right before the season starts. But it's another thing entirely to do that, cut your top two guys in a particular position, and have no plan whatsoever to replace them. Yet, that's exactly what happened in 1970 with Washington. And more than half a century later, it deserves a deep dive. Because this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, some of the dumbest roster construction in NFL history, and how not to build a team. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel, because we post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL with stories like this one that you might not have heard of before. So if you like that sort of stuff and want to join this community of football and sports historians, then this is the place for you. Thanks in advance for liking and subscribing, and with that in mind, let's talk about the time that Sonny Jurgensen was asking why about the guys out wide. Before I talk about the decision that Bill Austin decided to make, and just how nonsensical it was, we need some context to understand what the original plan was for Washington when it came to wide receiver. And I should know with all of this that back in 1970, you didn't really see receivers moving all around the field. Today, you can see Justin Jefferson line up on the right side of the field on one snap, then motion on the next snap, then line up on the left side the next snap, then play out of the slot, and so on and so forth. But back then, you didn't really see that. You had a right side receiver that played on the right side of the field, and a left side receiver that played on the left side of the field. And they weren't all that flexible. So just keep that in mind when watching all of this. And on the right side of the field, as you can probably tell, Washington was perfectly fine. That wasn't the issue. The reason that Washington was fine was because they had this man right here they've been watching, Charlie Taylor. Taylor is one of the greatest receivers in the history of the National Football League, as he would make it to the Pro Bowl 8 times, would lead the league in receptions twice, and would eventually be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. By the time Taylor's career was done, after the 1977 season, he had 649 receptions for 9,110 yards and 79 touchdowns. This put him 4th all-time in receiving yards, only behind Don Maynard, Lance Allworth, and Raymond Berry, 6th all-time in receiving touchdowns, and 1st all-time in receptions. Taylor was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and it's not too hard to see why with numbers and production like that. Hard to keep the all-time leading receiver in receptions out of the Hall. So on the right side, there was no issue. Charlie Taylor was the guy, and that was set in stone. Now, the left side, that was an entirely different matter. The original plan was to have this man right here, Bob Long, play on that side of the field. Long played with the Packers in the mid-60s, and while he was buried on the depth chart there, he came out of retirement in 1969 to play under Vince Lombardi and give it one more go. And during that 1969 season, with Washington, Long put up some of the best numbers of his career, posting 48 receptions for 533 yards, setting career highs in both of those categories. He even had a few games where he had over 100 yards receiving. For some perspective, in his 4 seasons with the Packers under Lombardi, he only had 1 season with 100 yards receiving total. Long loved playing for Lombardi, but Lombardi was no longer there when the rosters were due in early September of 1970. He was not Bill Austin's guy, and that was amplified by his poor preseason, where he caught just 4 passes in 5 games and looked a bit lethargic. He went from catching 3.5 passes per regular season game in 1969 to under a pass per game in the preseason in 1970, at a time when Washington was playing its starters for the majority of the game, and at a time where preseason actually meant a whole lot. So with that in mind, Bill Austin decided that Long on the left side wasn't going to work out, and he cut him. But okay, maybe you can't have Long on the left side, but you can have his backup take over his spot, right? Enter this man right here, Marshall Cropper. Austin knew him pretty well, seeing as Austin was the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers from 1966 to 68, before being replaced by the much more successful Chuck Noll. And Cropper was with the Steelers for the last 3 seasons. Cropper didn't do much with Pittsburgh, hence why there's literally only 1 clip I could find of him actually catching a pass, so my apologies if you're seeing this clip over and over. He caught just 14 passes for 181 yards in his 3 seasons, never finding the end zone. However, Austin liked him enough and hoped that he could develop into something with Washington. Austin liked the guy enough to sign him a few years ago in Pittsburgh, and when he became available after the Steelers waived him, Austin thought that he could work his magic. Alas, he could not, as Cropper was cut. Said Austin on the decision to cut Cropper, he didn't come along as we'd hope. So now, if you're this man right here in Bill Austin, you were kind of screwed. Your starting left side wideout was cut, and your backup left side wideout was cut. Oh, and the season starts in a week. You have, quite literally, no receivers to play that position. Which raises the question, what do you do? What's the master plan here? We've seen teams cut players that were expected to be contributors right before the season started, and it ended up working out. But part of why it worked out for those teams was because they had a plan. They had a clear-cut, identifiable plan. There was a rookie that was coming along nicely, and they wanted to give him an increased role. They had a trade in the works for a star player. They were going to change their system and make it fit the players they currently have. Whatever the case, there was a plan. Bill Austin, on the other hand, had no plan. At least, no plan that you could consider to be any good. Because his plan to fill the left side at wide receiver, keeping in mind that he wanted more speed, was, well, kind of insane. Step 1 in the plan. Move this man right here, Pat Richter, over to wide receiver. Remember when Austin said he wanted more speed? Yeah, Richter's a freaking tight end. Not exactly the guy that you associate with being speed demons. Also making things worse was the fact that Richter was very clearly past his prime, had no catches in 1969 despite not being injured, and was more known for his abilities as a punter than his abilities as a tight end. For whatever reason, the grand plan for Austin at starter on the left side was to have a guy start outside who was on the decline, who was not a receiver, who was not fast, who had no catches in 1969 and 1 catch in 1967, and had 7 or fewer receptions in 4 of the previous 6 seasons. For some perspective, this is like if the Jacksonville Jaguars decided that the best course of action to fixing their problem at wide receiver outside of Brian Thomas Jr. was to move Johnny Munt over to the outside. Not a smart plan. But wait a second, time out. Washington cut 2 guys. They got rid of Bob Long and Marshall Cropper. So you have to replace both of them. You replace your starter with Pat Richter, but who is going to be the backup? Well, get ready for this. Because the backup was going to be this man right here, John Henderson. Yes, there was more than one player named John Henderson in the NFL, although this one was not a defensive tackle and was way less successful. The Steelers drafted Henderson in the 3rd round of the 1968 NFL Draft, and now that he was no longer with the team, Austin thought he was worth a look again. The problem? Henderson was so bad and so ineffective at wide receiver that he had literally switched positions to defensive back, where he was subsequently cut by the Minnesota Vikings. This meant that the plan at starting wide receiver for Washington was a tight end, and if that didn't work, the backup was a defensive back. You replaced 2 wide receivers with a tight end and a defensive back, hoping that they could both play wide receiver when, quite literally, nothing had shown that they could. And they remind you, this was 1 week before the season started. I am genuinely baffled as to what the plan was here by this man right here in Bill Austin. Like, what's the logic? You're cutting your starting left side receiver and your backup left side receiver, leaving you with no guys on the left side, only to replace them with a guy who has never played wide receiver before and is considerably slower than the 2 guys you cut, and a guy who was so bad at wide receiver that he didn't even play that position during training camp in 1970 and train at that position as he changed positions to the opposite side of the ball. It's one thing to have a plan that doesn't work out. Believe me, that happens all the time. It's another thing to have a plan that's so nonsensical that it genuinely might be better if you wing it. This is like firing your entire IT department and replacing them with one guy who's never touched a computer before and your 90-year-old grandma who thinks she's one email from a Nigerian prince away from becoming a multi-millionaire. And I'm not the only one who thought this plan by Bill Austin was stupid. When your own quarterback is questioning what the logic is here, that's when you know. Because Sonny Jurgensen was baffled at the decision-making and was thinking out loud, Coach, why'd you get rid of everyone who could play that position? Said Jurgensen, I don't want to sound like I'm knocking anyone, but we need more speed outside. Without it, they'll double up and overload the right side. Jurgensen said he didn't want to knock anyone, but then proceeded to say quite bluntly, yeah, this ain't gonna work. Playing a tight end at wide receiver when you want us to be faster isn't going to work. Playing a defensive back who flamed out at receiver is also not going to work. Nothing about this strategy is going to work. And you're going to be absolutely shocked to find out that this did not work out. Combined, over the course of the entire season, as the left side guys, John Henderson and Pat Richter had 15 catches for 206 yards. That's not one guy's numbers over the course of a couple of weeks. That's not their combined numbers over a month-long stretch. That's their numbers over the course of the entire season, with a cherry on top being the fact that Henderson and Richter never played in the NFL again after that 1970 campaign. I can't believe that failed. I can't believe Bill Austin's team started the year off 4-8 and looked like one of the worst teams in the league. I can't believe that the team finished in the bottom 10 of the league in passing yards. Who could have possibly seen this coming except for, literally everyone else in Washington, D.C.? Thank God they get Roy Jefferson in 1971, as in an actual wide receiver. Because to say that this 1970 experiment was a disaster would be putting it very lightly. So what did we learn from all of this? If you're constructing a roster, it's probably not a good idea to cut your starter and your backup right before the season commences. And if you're going to do that for some reason, don't replace those 2 players with players who are not accustomed to playing that position and were not fit to play there. If you need to find 2 circles, and your plan for finding the circles is, with no time whatsoever, to get a square and a triangle to take over, that's probably not going to work out. The 1970 season for Washington was a chaotic, messy campaign. And even though interim head coach Bill Austin was thrust into an almost impossible role, he didn't make life easy for himself or for the team with this asinine roster management. Because in 1970, when it came to the team in the nation's capital, the left side of the field was left abandoned. Check out our live streaming schedule for the next few days. We're live every single day on this channel, whether we're covering a sporting event or playing GeoGuessr or just taking your requests. So make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live and so that you can join this community. Also, thanks to all our members and our Patreon supporters who get exclusive perks like their name of the end of each video, members-only Q&A streams, and cool emojis to use on videos and during streams. See how you can join this community and become a member or a Patreon member by clicking the link in the description below.